I'll guard
You can't touch the keys, I don't care.
I'm just trying to because he's going to be right back, but he wants to take action from the press.
Okay, that's fine. Awesome,
Sorry,
thank
just
you.
call us snacks.
Okay, so I believe my recording equipment is ready, so whenever.
Right. Right. Take it back.
Oh, so we would like to first state acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the Menominee and Ho-Chunk tribe as the indigenous inhabitants of the land upon which we are meeting today. In addition, I welcome those in attendance from countries outside of the United States. This land which we are meeting in is on stolen land from indigenous groups, and we want to take a quick moment of silence to acknowledge that. Thank you. So, I am forced to introduce myself first. Hi, my name is Fuji. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as gender fluid, and I am Asian American. I almost said my major again. I'm so used to college stuff, sorry.
My name is Brandon. My pronouns are he, him, his. I identify as trans and also biracial.
Hi, my name's Miranda. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a cisgender woman, and I am also biracial.
My name is Colton. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. My Amtgard name was Nephilim, and I identify as non-binary.
Also, this is Bean.
Yep.
She's
She's right here.
my partner service.
Yep.
What pronouns is being used?
She, her, hers, or they, them, pretty much any. She's been called he as well. Yes, yes.
Okay, so thank you for letting us introduce ourselves. Now I would like to ask everyone to introduce themselves. I think it's important with any conversation that we're having or training or anything to just get to know each other and be a little bit more intimate. I'd like to ask you for your name, your pronouns, and then something you'd like to get out of this training today.
In whichever way you want to start, whoever, etc.
I think we should start with Vitalin.
Why do we have to?
I'll
Exactly,
start.
that's how you
I'm
know when you get
Alan. My name is Adam or Nadir. I identify as male, but you can feel free to practice with any pronouns on me. All right, Battalion, you're number 2.
Okay. My name's Vitalin. My pronouns are he, him, his. I identify as male, cis male. I'm looking for just a quality recording.
Oh, I see how it is.
My purpose is redundant.
My name is Devin. Any pronouns other than he, she, or they. If you don't know pronouns, we have cheat cards. As Rune, pronouns are a little more complicated. Talk to me afterwards. I identify as asexual, pansexual, polyromantic, and genderless, and I'm here because I like these people.
Hi, I'm Rose, Amtgard named Etta, she, her pronouns. I'm sitting in for the second time just to see if there are any additional insights I can pick up.
Oh, thank God.
I'm Luna. You can call me Luna. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as cis female, and I just like learning things. Also, I know them. I know Colton from a long time ago.
Long time ago.
I'm Kayla or Suachi, she, her. I'm here because I want to learn how to diffuse situations better.
I'm Gary or Advar. I identify as he, him, his, and I'm here as a member of the board players.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Gerald or Zach McNasty.
Wait.
No. Can you get it?
Oh, Sarah Zach McNasty. Title, the Wanker Banker. I just got added.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Gary.
This is why we can't.
Legit names, not a joke.
That's an actual Amtgard name.
Well, the other one was just added, and I didn't give that to myself. So,
So can you repeat that though? Actually.
Sarah Zach McNasty.
Cool. Love it.
I prefer him, her, I mean, sorry, him, her. You know what, it doesn't even
Whatever.
matter. I don't really care what pronoun you use.
Gender's a social construct.
Yes.
Mood.
My name's Alan, or Duran. I will say I'm very naive to the whole him, her thing, so this is going to be kind of a learning experience for me. I often find myself saying the wrong stuff at the wrong time. Thank you, I was going to get one of these. And I do not want to offend anybody, and if I do, I apologize beforehand. I do want to start doing more stuff, and I need to learn.
Well, this is the place to start.
Yeah, that's awesome. We always love that.
Yeah.
I'm Shale Nifty, or Jory Phillips. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I identify as a cisgender male. Thank you. Did I forget anything?
What do you want to
My major was graphic arts and printing.
I forgot something.
Graphic design.
Hey!
I forgot something. I identify as a male, and my pronouns are him and his and
You get that?
me.
And then,
That is a pronoun, yes.
what did you want to get out of this training?
I'd like to understand better diffusing techniques. That would be most beneficial.
Mood.
Sit your ass down and be good.
I'm Adam, also known as Armstrong in Amtgard. For this he, him, his, and I'm just here for more learning experience.
I'm Will Jordan, or Michael Hammer of God. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm here because first, I'm certain there's things I should learn. Like I've done some reading on this topic, and I'm not ignorant, but there's always something to learn. But I also think it's critical that high-profile people in our organization come to things like this.
Love it. Yeah, and so a little bit about us just before we get started. So we all work together at an LGBT center, but we also have various contexts that we also have in our lives that kind of bring forward a wide variety of different experiences to kind of inform the talk that we're having today. I know for myself, I have published research on transgender issues. I also worked at a at-risk group home, working in crisis intervention there, and residential stuff as well.
Yeah, I work at the LGBT Center with everyone. I also am currently getting my minor in disability studies. So I am currently the disability advocate for our organization, as well as I do have a few disabilities myself, both visible and invisible, and so I'd like to help along that path.
I have research in bias and privilege. I identify as a person of color, so I have those experiences as well. I've worked at a sexual assault domestic violence shelter, and I also I'm the director of diversity and inclusivity for student government, so I work with a lot of issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion.
I also work closely with QTPOC, queer and trans people of color at my university. I'm also an immigrant, so I kind of talk a lot about that and kind of talk about how it is to like live here from like a separate background. I'm also, non-binary, so I talk about that experience a lot as well.
Yeah, a wide variety and a wide spectrum of identities and experiences, which is what we wanted to intentionally provide for you all today. Because one voice is good, but a lot of voices is better. So getting started, we're going to go through this kind of in two parts. We're going to start kind of with crisis intervention, how to handle different scenarios that you might encounter when you're working security at an event, doing those things. And then once we have a solid foundation, we're going to complicate things a little bit, and we're going to talk about handling security with issues of privilege, power, difference, and interacting with people who are different from you. So that's where the cultural sensitivity component will come in. So starting with just some basic stuff surrounding crisis, Miranda, take it away.
Okay, so first off, always report. We do not have the specific things on who you report to. You will talk to Adam about that and get all the necessary procedures for reporting. Additionally, I'd like to go over some grounding techniques that can really help for individuals who may be experiencing an anxiety attack or a panic attack or anything where they are not grounded into what is currently happening. So the first one that I want to go over is kind of like a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it's 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So this really helps to ground a person to the area that they are currently at. It helps in any situation. And we can quickly just run through that real quick. So if you all would like to, I'll just go through them a little slower. And each time I say them, you can think about each number of items that you can see, feel, hear. And that can even be, if for seeing, that's obviously anything around here. For feeling, it can be your shirt, it can be feeling your skin, it can be feeling what you're sitting on. If you aren't wearing shoes, if you're walking through like the grass or something, feeling the grass between your toes or dirt or anything like that. So if we look around, we can see 5 things that we see. So that could be the wood, it could be the leaves, the grass, the benches. If we go into 4 things that you can feel, it can be any shirt that you're wearing, where you're sitting, you can feel the bugs. 3 things you can hear, that would be people practicing combat maneuvers, me talking, the bugs. And then 2 things you can smell. So that bug spray. Yep, bug spray, maybe something else you can smell. And then 1 thing that you can taste. So if you're eating a cookie or you just had food, you might be tasting that still in your mouth. If you're drinking some water or beer or any other type of alcohol, just that in your mouth for it. Another grounding technique is to have either yourself or the person that you're discussing with sit down and focus on breathing and really feel, they can feel the fabric of or texture of a shirt or a chair next to them, because that really helps ground a person. So having them sit and just collect their breath and take deep breaths in and exhaling through their, I always forget it.
It depends.
Yeah, it depends for the person. And so really just giving them the time and space to come back to this space and to be fully grounded. Another way for grounding is to have an individual pat or tap parts of their body. So if they're sitting down, they can pat their legs. And this is a physical stimulation that just gets them to know that this is their body and they are here. They can also tap their feet to the ground if they want. Also, a more not very super visible thing and also not very auditory is tapping their collarbones, because that will send vibrations throughout your body that you can definitely feel. So please don't do these to people. It's kind of, you want to, consent is important, and you don't want to just go and touch someone and start hitting their collarbone or their legs, because then they might be like, what the heck are you doing? But pretty much just talking them through this and be like, hey, this might work. It might not work for everyone. These are just a few couple grounding techniques, and some people might have other techniques that work better for them. So next I'll talk about what to do if people fight or are fighting that's not in role play, or also dealing with like conflict resolution. So first thing is to respond quickly. If you see something and you do not think that it is currently in like the role playing aspect of it, and you think that they're actually fighting, drop what you're doing, head over there to assess the situation, which is the next thing. Make sure that, one, no one is getting hurt, and also we don't want to do any physical contact. So I believe that's one of the rules for this, especially for security. So you don't want to do any physical contact unless someone is in serious like danger. So if someone has the potential to be seriously hurt, that's the only point in time in which you're able to step in. Otherwise, you can call authority if it is deemed necessary. The next point is don't assume blame on any given party. Just be open, listen to both sides if you can. But you kind of want to just get them to calm down and just talk to you. It doesn't have to be you just talking to each people or each person. If you have multiple people with you, that is even better, because then you can kind of give them a break and a space to really calm down. The next thing would be trying to facilitate effective communication. So get these people to just talk about maybe after they've calmed down a little bit, how this might have came about. It's okay if no one knows. It's okay if they don't want to talk about it. Those are all valid responses. Just remember that if you do reports, you might need to be extensive on how you handle the situation. So if you're getting into a fight or you see a fight and you are trying to stop it, you may not want to jump in, because you could also get punched or hit or anything that would not be fun if you're not expecting it. Okay. And so it's good to be aware of not only yourself but also the people around you. Yeah, and with the effective communication, just try to let all the parties involved speak, and try to take other people's perspectives as well. So that also goes into the don't assume, blame, or don't go in with already kind of being like, oh, I know what happened type thing. So just listen to everyone, let them talk, get their side of the story, and just be like, okay, I can take this, and you can just take that information, you go with it, and hopefully through getting them down and grounding them, they aren't going to jump back into a fight right after. So yeah, so if you are unable to, if you can't separate them at all, you can go to a higher authority. You don't really want to be just one person standing and trying to push two people around, so if you have two people that can kind of sandwich in between and separate when the time is right, that would be really beneficial. Yeah, and like I said, just try to de-escalate the fight so that everyone's happy.
And on the note of de-escalation, so obviously, you know, research and models are really important, and so with my experience working in a group home, I wanted to bring in this model for nonviolent de-escalation called CPI, and that's just one form of nonviolent crisis management. Obviously, we could have a whole 4-hour training on specifically just one model of nonviolent crisis intervention, but I wanted to bring their top 10 de-escalation tips today, just for sake of time, and kind of break down those tips with you because they're really helpful. So the first tip is be empathetic and non-judgmental. Obviously, as has already been alluded to, you know, when you're coming into a situation, you're not really knowing what's happening. Like, has anyone had an experience where they were like a little kid and they were fighting with another little kid, and they're like, and you're saying, oh, well, they started it, and like your parents are like, oh, I don't care who started it, like I'm finishing it or whatever, and not like taking into consideration like the context of how the situation came to be, and not really empathizing with you, and that's not a really fun place to be in, even if there's reasons that a parent might just be, you know, ending some conflict. So it's really important to understand that there's a bigger context that led to the situation that you probably might not be aware of. So being open and empathetic to that understanding and getting that information from them and having an open mind as to how that situation came to be. Next, respect personal space. I don't know if anyone has been in a super activated, super frustrated space and then someone just comes right into your zone, and that's super not helpful. And so the important thing is to respect someone's personal space when you're trying to de-escalate, because getting into their personal space and crossing that boundary and having them feel another sense of violation could escalate them even further. So if someone, say I'm trying to de-escalate Miranda and she's really activated, she's like, hey, like you're in my personal space right now, like I just need you to back up. Okay, acknowledge that their personal space is important, back up to a space where you feel you can still engage with them appropriately, but also not be compromising their personal boundaries, and just back up and respect that space. Next is use non-threatening nonverbals. So I'm training as a therapist, and so in talks about therapy, what we say is 10% of communication is verbal and 90% is nonverbal, and so that gets into a lot of things like your body language, how you're saying things, and so being very mindful of not only how you're talking with this person, but how you're talking with them and also the mannerisms that you're presenting. So more closed body language, like having your arms crossed, can be seen as really like emotionally closed off as well as physically, and a person might not be willing to speak with you because of the reaction in their brain that they have upon seeing that body language. As well, another example that was mentioned in the previous session is if you're coming to address the situation, like calmly but quickly approaching versus like sprinting to a situation. Like if you're seen just like charging at them, like there will be some guards put up there as well. So just being very mindful of that body language. The recommendation that we talked about was very open. Yeah, the Steve Irwin approach, like, okay, like let's address this calmly, like both having your guard up to protect yourself, but also like being more open rather than like closed off. The next tip is avoid overreacting. Once again, especially because we mentioned, you know, if you look around right now, there's people fighting. And so it can be very easy to misconstrue what may or may not be something that you need to intervene in. And so making sure that you're being mindful of the appropriate amount of reaction to any situation, because if you overreact to a situation, you might even create a situation where there hadn't originally been one, because now they're upset and activated because they were assumed to be doing something. So bringing in proportional reaction, and that's just going to be something that you're going to have to trust your instinct and kind of feel out. That's not something we're going to have like a wave your magic wand kind of magical answer to. And you'll just have to trust your gut and trust your instincts, but making sure to constantly check in with yourself. Okay, am I like giving the appropriate reaction, but am I also not like overdoing it, kind of a thing. Focus on feelings. Once again, any situation where someone is activated probably stemmed from somewhere. So getting to the bottom of what feelings are kind of being activated and validating and acknowledging those feelings and finding a way to have productive space to process those feelings, because half the time with conflict that we're having, they're totally understandable feelings, but the way someone is acting out upon those feelings isn't productive or isn't appropriate, and that's what happens a lot of the time. So saying, okay, you know, I see you fighting with this person, okay, what was that about? Like, oh, well, you were frustrated that they did this thing. Like, I totally get that. We can't, you know, face slam them into a tree. That's not appropriate. Like, but acknowledging the frustration and working together with them to come to a productive way to manage their feelings. Ignore challenging questions as well. People aren't being put on trial here, unless they are, if that's the role play. But so, on one end, with previous things I've mentioned, you know, kind of getting to the bottom of things, but also on the other end, not getting to the bottom of things as well, which can be really confusing. But so with challenging questions, you know, not really, like a good example would be, you know, asking why they thought like something was okay, like, and challenging kind of like their morality as to how they got into a certain situation. Granted, that may be a good question for after the fact when they're calmed down, but if someone's in a really activated place, like they're not going to be wanting to hear like, oh, why did you do that? Like that's not going to be the very helpful thing to make them calm down. So making sure that your questions are exploratory, inquisitive, and not really like challenging and invalidating.
Do you have an example of a question that isn't, that wouldn't be activating? Is that a proper?
Yeah, so like an example of a good question to ask. So instead of like, oh, why did you think that was okay? Like, because once again, they got to that point, there's nothing that we can do about it besides just stop it right now. We can have conversation later about how to make sure that doesn't happen again, but now's not the time to have that conversation. Now is just addressing the situation that is happening. So asking more of a question like, okay, so like how did it get to this point? You're not putting a moral stance on what happened. You're just asking, okay, how did we get to this point? What happened? Like, talk to me. It's very open. It allows them to express what they need to express, and helps you also get to the bottom of it, and be empathetic and whatnot. Do that?
Could you do the two questions next to each other, just so it's a little bit easier for us to.
Yeah.
track.
So an example. Okay. So say Miranda and Brandon are LARPing, and like Brandon accidentally hits Miranda like a little hard in the side, so she just whaps him in the face. So the question isn't, that's not going to be productive, especially if you know Miranda. It's going to be, well, why did you think it was okay to like hit him in the face? Like the question would be like, okay, like how did it come to this situation where Brandon is now like on the ground bleeding? Like what happened? Just talk to me. And Miranda will be like, oh, like, you know, he hit me, so I hit him back. And then I say, okay, well, let's calm down, and then we can have a conversation about how to appropriately handle that later once everyone's like cooled down. Because I'm also assuming Brandon's going to be probably slightly pissed too.
Touching up point on that, I have, in my experience, using the words calm down has never actually worked to help calm someone down. Is there better language to use to diffuse a situation? Like, would you instead say, let's take a few deep breaths?
Yeah.
Or
do you have something?
Something's good.
Honestly, a lot of the breathe, like just breathe or whatever, can have the same effect. Something that I found works, especially since security is going to be in groups of 2. Separating them, just be like, hey, step away with me for a minute.
Yeah, walk with me. Come over here. Tell me what happened.
Yeah. Like, let's talk about it.
Talk rather than being like, just breathe, because that's the same idea of just calm down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah. So the next tip, set limits. This one is really important. So recognizing that you're doing security, you're obviously here to perform a task, but also recognizing that some things that may happen are going to be above your pay grade, which is a weird thing since I believe you'll be volunteering for it. But just recognizing there's going to be some things that are outside of the scope of your ability within that position, both for just number one, appropriate handling of procedures, but also 2, your physical safety. Like if you have, like you as a one security person, if there's like a whole like mosh pit pile of people just beating up on each other, like you're not really gonna want to try and just get in the middle of that. Like that is, no, don't hurt yourself. So recognizing both your physical limits and your emotional limits, and that's okay, because it's much better to say, hey, I'm not the person to handle this right now, like I need to get someone else who can, than just trying anyways and making it even worse. And so recognizing your own limits, setting your own personal limits. With the teams, it will also be really helpful once you handle a situation, like allowing yourself the space to kind of step out for a bit, and I'll get back on that later, but really just like setting those personal boundaries to make sure that this is still an experience that's not harmful for you, because you also deserve to have a fun time even if you're working security. Choose wisely what you insist upon. If you're going to insist that something happen, like say people go separate ways, be really intentional about both your justification for doing that, but also what you tell them. If you have 2 people who were just super activated and your decision is, okay, just go separate, and now you put 2 people who are already activated into other groups of people where they may still be activated, like that might not be helpful. So saying like, okay, like I need y'all to just go simmer and like chill, like somewhere like for a sec until you can come back to any people, et cetera, or just do whatever you need to calm down. Because on the other end, they might be like, okay, I just need to go like talk to this person. Yeah.
I think it's worth remembering that during security details, knowing the culture of our game, the vast majority of people are going to be intoxicated, which means emotions flare and situations get activated easily.
Yep, absolutely, that's really important, thank you. Yeah, so then the last 2 kind of go hand in hand. So allow silence and space for reflection. So like I said, these are going to be really stressful things, and almost part of this is when you go into these situations of activation, part of you is actually taking on the activation that's kind of happening, and it's really stressful and it's really unfortunate, but that's just how the job is. And so allowing yourself the space after the fact to go kind of process, kind of go let that out, like shake a little bit, et cetera, and then get back into the gig, basically. And then allowing time for decisions also. If possible, come back to a decision about how to move forward with anything, especially if there's things like conduct. that need to happen based on an event. Oftentimes, and I'm sure many people can attest to it, the decisions that you make in the moment probably aren't the smartest. Granted, now there will be sometimes situations where you have to make an immediate decision, and that's where I would recommend bringing in as many people to make that decision as possible, because then it can be as informed as possible. But if possible, allowing time to come back and make an informed decision that you've had time to reflect upon and know you're making the right decision. So with that, we have a couple case study scenarios that we're going to go through super quick and kind of give examples and kind of have y'all have the opportunity to be like, oh, I do this thing, and we'll talk about it and say, yay, because we're all great people with great ideas and want to do right. So the first scenario, so we kind of hit on this a little bit, but now you get the chance to apply it. So you see two people engaging in what appears to be an altercation. However, you acknowledge that this may be part of their gaming experience, but they are shouting at each other, it's getting really aggressive, etc., etc. How do you determine when the line is crossed between roleplay and an incident you need to intervene in? So what's the moment where you're like, okay, I need to address this? Yeah.
So, my gut feeling in this organization is it mostly depends on the context.
Yep.
If they are in an environment where it is very talky and there's a lot of emphasis on the character, then that point is going to be very far down the road.
Yep.
If they're in an environment where they've been pushing their adrenaline and hitting each other with sticks, and they're already emotionally interested, and they've got all that chemical going, that point is pretty early. As soon as the voices start getting raised, I don't want you to tell me that you're fighting and yelling in role play, because you're probably not.
Yep.
That's my
absolutely.
take on
That's an important point. Yeah.
For me, it's pretty easy to tell between role play and not, because it's the nature of the person's aggression. So you can tell when someone's upset if they're typically on the losing side of a game that is seen as imbalanced, and you can see people will start to flare up and they will start to use more curse words versus actual spell casting. And so that's when it's easier to tell.
Curse words versus cursing people.
Yeah. Language is a big thing.
Another thing that was brought up in the previous session that I think was really important is, regardless of if they're role playing or not, if people around are starting to get uncomfortable, that's really important. I think Devin, was that you that brought it up last time? Yeah. Brownie points for Devin. So those are all great examples. So with the question then, so assuming you intervene, how would you respond if they indicate that it's just part of the game?
I would probably go along the lines of, I understand that this is how your character would act. However, looking at the situation around us, with making people uncomfortable, or mentioning, hey, let's just tone it down a little bit, because this level is a little too much.
Exactly. I'll probably do exactly that. It's you're making other people feel uncomfortable. And worrying other people, that's something they understand.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can we back up a little bit?
Yeah, what's up?
So let's say I'm observing some people and they're doing their sword fighting thing, and then they start getting into the talking, and I'm not quite sure if it's to that